Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series on the life and the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. I believe I mentioned it last week, but I am hoping to finish this series tonight and next week. After that is Pesach, and plus I will be gone for up to 2 months. We are going to have a break in the learning, and then we'll start a whole new series. Make sure you follow your emails that you get from Or Chadash and the WhatsApp messages that you get constantly for more updates. As I've told people already, I'm not disappearing. You will get the weekly Haftorah, numerical gems every week, the mass email every week, and perhaps little snippets during our trip I will be sending out. And so you'll still be getting lots of materials from Or Chadash. Tonight, we're going to deal mostly with two very, very important events in the life of the Baal Shem Tov. And the first one, I'm going to actually read a letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law. We've discussed his brother-in-law many times, Rabbi Gershon of Kitov, his brother-in-law. And this letter that he wrote and this incident that he describes comes after he attempted to come to Eretz Yisrael. If you remember, we spent, I think, an entire class on discussing the Baal Shem Tov's attempt to come to Eretz Yisrael. And I remember the week after, we discussed even in greater depth what caused him to want to come to Eretz Yisrael. And a lot of it had to do with his belief that if he could meet the Or HaChaim here in Israel, he and the Or HaChaim would be able to bring the Messianic era much closer. We know that he did not make it to Eretz Yisrael. It was clear that heaven did not want him to come. He and his daughter and scribe almost died along the way. But he goes back to Europe and he makes his home base in Mezebush. And that's where the Hasidic movement really began to blossom and grow. This letter I'm going to read is, in a sense, a further attempt by the Baal Shem Tov to try to bring the Messianic era closer. If you remember, along with the core group of scholars that he was attracting to him, that would then, after his death, would be responsible with spreading Chassidut even farther than it was. By the time the Baal Shem Tov passed away, there were tens of thousands of people who now identified as being Hasidim in cities and villages all over Eastern Europe. But as we'll see in the second incident we'll discuss tonight, when the Maggid of Mezrich took over the Hasidic movement, then it really expanded tremendously. So this letter is, the Baal Shem Tov is still in touch with the hidden tzaddikim. This is a theme that we've seen throughout his life. From the time he was a child, he was connected to this secret group of hidden tzaddikim who were trying to bring encouragement, teaching, love to all of Israel in a very, very hidden way. And even though he was now known and he had revealed himself, he still was very much in contact with this group of Hin Tzaddikim. And because of the dire situation in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Russia, in Latvia, the oppression, the poverty, the unsurety, pogroms all the time, blood libels all the time, massacres all the time, that the Baal Shem felt a pressing need to try to help bring Mashiach. And this letter is somewhat edited. It's parts of the letter. But I'm going to read the whole thing to you. And it begins like this. Again, this is the letter that the Baal Shem Tov wrote to his brother-in-law. And in fact, this is one of the only written documents that we have from the Baal Shem Tov. As we know, he didn't write any books, and his correspondence is unknown. This letter is, in a certain way, is the main piece of evidence that we have directly going back to the Baal Shem Tov. Dara is asking, is this letter included in books? So here, I'm reading from Rav Ginsburg's The Hebrew Letters. And because in this letter is the backbone teaching of the Hebrew letters, especially as developed by Rav Ginsburg. So it does appear in this book, and it appears in other books in Hebrew. I believe it's in the Keter Shem Tov, and it's probably in a few of the other books, Shivchei Abesht, in Hebrew. But this is in English. Here we go. On Rosh Hashanah of the year 5507, which translates into 1746. Here, the Baal Shem Tov was 44 years old when he wrote this letter. Remember, he revealed himself when he was 36 years old. So this is 8 years into the spread of the Hasidic movement. So I'll start again. On Rosh Hashanah of the year 5507, I performed by means of an oath an elevation of soul as known to you, and saw wondrous things I had never seen before. I'm just going to interject that the Baal Shem Tov, because of his learning with Eliyahu Navi and Achia Hashiloni, learned methods to have out-of-body experiences where his soul would leave his body and would enter into the heavenly realms. That's what's called an aliyat of soul. So that's what the Baal Shem Tov is saying, that I experienced one of these elevations of souls. And he says, I saw things I've never seen before. What I saw and learned there is impossible to convey in words, even face to face. I ascended from level to level. And in the expanded letter, he actually describes going to different rooms or chambers in the heavenly courts where sages of old, the patriarchs were. All of them were learning Torah. And then he says, I ascended from level to level until I entered the chamber of the Mashiach, where the Mashiach learns Torah with all the sages and tzaddikim, and also with the 7 shepherds. I asked the Mashiach, when will the master come? These words, when will the master come, are the same words of a very famous story in the Talmud, where Yeshua ben Levi, one of the great sages, also had an elevation of soul, and he also entered into the chamber where the soul of Mashiach is waiting until he is revealed. And he asked the same question: when is the master coming? In that story, Mashiach says, Hayom, today. And of course, Yeshua ben Levi is like, today? Oh my gosh. The whole day, he's like sitting on needles in anticipation. When is the great shofar going to blow? When is Mashiach going to reveal himself? By the end of the day, it hadn't happened. Shortly after that, he has a vision, a meeting with Elijah the prophet. And he says, the Mashiach lied to me. He said he was coming Hayom, today. And Eliyahu said, you misunderstood. When he said Hayom, it was part of a verse which says, Hayom im tishma'u, today if you will listen to the voice of God. And so what it meant is, Mashiach is saying, I will come today as soon as the Jewish people are ready and are listening and fulfilling God's will. Here, the Baal Shem Tov asks the same question. He says, when is the master coming? Here, though, he gets a different answer. And in a certain way, this becomes the basis of the entire Hasidic movement. Mashiach answered, by this you shall know, when your teaching will become public and revealed in the world, and your well springs burst forth to the farthest corners, that which I have taught you and you have comprehended, and they also shall be able to perform unifications and elevations as you do, then all of the shells will cease to exist, and there shall be a time of goodwill and salvation. In other words, the Mashiach was putting it back on the Baal Shem Tov. In other words, it's dependent on your teachings reaching the farthest limits until they've spread to the entire world. So how did the Baal Shem Tov, and in Hebrew, it's Vayifutsu Ma'anetecha Chutza. When the well springs of your teachings spread to the farthest reaches. So the Baal Shem continues his letter. I stood in wonder and great distress as to the length of time necessary for this to occur. When could this be? But from what I learned there, 3 potent practices and 3 holy names, easy to learn and explain, my mind settled, and I thought that possibly by means of these, men of my nature will be able to achieve levels similar to mine. But I was not given permission all my life to reveal this. But this I may inform you, and may God help you. Your way shall be in the presence of God, and never leave your consciousness in the time of your prayer and study. Every word of your lips intend to unite. For in every letter, now what the next part becomes the basis of Rav Ginsburg's teachings on the Hebrew letters. And that's why this letter is printed in the very beginning of the book. Because what the Baal Shem Tov learned from the Mashiach is the inner teachings of the Hebrew letters. So he says like this: every word of your lips intend to unite, for in every letter there are worlds, souls, and divinity, and they ascend and connect and unify with each other. And afterwards, the letters connect and unify to become a word, and then unify in true unification in divinity. So what he's saying here, and again, this is the basis of Rav Ginsburg's books, is that every letter has a manifestation in the worlds, meaning in the physical material world. Each of the letters has the way that it influences reality. That's what it means, when it says that God looked into the Torah and created the world. Because what is the Torah? Basically, words. And what are words made out of? Letters. So the Baal Shem Tov is saying every letter has a reality, a manifestation, and an influence in the worlds, the physical material worlds, in the soul. That is talking, of course, of the emotional, the intellectual, the psychological, the intuitive, the behavioristic realities of the human psyche. Every letter is manifest in our very beings. And lastly, in divinity, meaning this, in a certain way, is the way that God relates to the letters. What Rav Ginsburg adds that the Baal Shem Tov doesn't say explicitly, but we know from many other sources that each letter has a form. The Hebrew letters are pictograms. They tell a story. Each letter has a name. The name has meaning. A, B, C, D, E has no meaning. But Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, they're words. They mean different things. And lastly, each letter has a numerical value. So the way Rav Ginsburg took the Baal Shem Tov's teaching is each letter will now have 9 ways that it is expressed in reality. The form of the letter has an influence in worlds, souls, and divinity. The name of the letter has a manifestation in worlds, souls, and divinity, and the number is manifest in worlds, souls, and divinity. So altogether, there are 9 levels. And I'll just show you an example. I don't think you'll be able to read the words, but every letter is set up like this, where the form is revealed in many different ways in the worlds, souls, and divinity. The same thing for the name, world, souls, and divinity, and the number, world, souls, and divinity. And it all comes from this letter from the Baal Shem Tov. I am continuing now. He says, include your soul with them in each and every state, and all the worlds unify as one and ascend to produce an infinitely great joy and pleasure. Here he's describing really the joy and pleasure of learning Torah in the text with the Hebrew letters. And you can understand from the joy of groom and bride in miniature. Now, as you can understand from the joy of groom and bride in miniature and physicality, how much more so in such an exalted level as this. Surely God will be your aid, and wherever you turn, you will succeed and reach greater awareness. Give to the wise, and he will become wiser. That's the end of the letter. As I said, this is not the complete letter, but it's the most important parts of it. But here, I want to emphasize this idea of the answer of the Mashiach. Here, I gave some insight into the Hebrew letters, but that's not what I want to concentrate on here. Here is what the Mashiach said to the Baal Shem Tov. Vayafutzu ma'inatecha chutza. When the well springs of your Torah will reach the furthest parts of the globe, to those who are the farthest away, not just physically, but spiritually. And at first, the Baal Shem Tov expressed almost distress, like, how is that going to happen? Well, what I would like to propose is that anyone who is connected to Chabad and wants to understand the Rebbe, so basically what the Rebbe did was he took these three words, Vayufutzu ma'inatecha chutza. In other words, he followed in the footsteps of the Baal Shem Tov, and the Rebbe was not the first one to send out shlichim. It was the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, once he had his core group that we've discussed for many, many weeks. One second. Once he had his core group, he began sending them out to different villages and cities, either for short visits in order to teach and encourage the people, or to set up a Hasidic community.
Michelle, can I ring you after? I'm in a
One
shoot.
second. I'm sorry, I didn't mute everyone, sorry. One second. Okay. He began sending people out to set up Hasidic communities. That process increased greatly with the Maggid of Mezrich. And we're going to get to him soon. So here, the Mashiach, the soul of Mashiach, tells the Baal Shem Tov, basically, you're on the right track. You have already revealed yourself. You are, the Baal Shem Tov traveled extensively, going out and spreading these teachings. And now the Mashiach said, I will come when these teachings spread. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe did, there's not even an adjective that can explain the greatness of what he did, is he basically sent shlichim, messengers, to set up Jewish institutions to the four corners of the world. There's virtually no campus in America that does not have a Chabad, and there's no state that doesn't have a Chabad, and the majority of countries in the world have Chabad. if we eliminate the Arab and Muslim countries where Chabad is, I shouldn't say that, because with the Avram Accords, with the Abraham Accords, there is Chabad in Dubai now and Bahrain. So Chabad is everywhere, because there is this core belief from this elevation of soul of the Baal Shem Tov, that when these teachings spread to the farthest reaches, and it's already said in the Zohar, really thousands of years before the Baal Shem Tov, and at least 500 years from the time that the Zohar was publicly revealed, the Zohar also says when the teachings of this book spread, Mashiach will come. The redemption will come, barachamim. And so this is a core idea in Chassidut in general. We'd say that in general, the Hasidic movement is we'll just say without embarrassment, is messianic, wants to bring Mashiach. Chabad is known for this, is known for this idea of spreading the teachings of Hasidut with the express hope and belief that by doing so will help bring the Messianic era. Okay, now we're going to continue, and we are going to go to the meeting between the Maggid of Mezrich and the Baal Shem Tov. This occurred approximately 10 years, around 3 years after this revelation of the Baal Shem Tov. And the story is the Maggid of Mezrich was known as a child prodigy. He became very famous in his own right. He became what's called a Maggid. A Maggid is, in English, we call it a preacher. Someone who would either go from place to place preaching, and we've already seen that this was just part and parcel of Jewish life in those days. But I mean, just like let's say today, someone goes on the lecture trail. I'm about to go on the lecture trail, right? I wouldn't call myself a Maggid, but it's the same idea. And we learned how some of the Maggids would preach fire and brimstone and severe warnings to the people if they don't change their ways. The Baal Shem Tov was adamantly against this kind of preaching. That's not what the Maggid did. The Maggid became very, very well known. He was absolutely brilliant, and not only as a Talmudic scholar, but he was highly invested in learning Kabbalah. So, as always, there are many, many different versions of how these stories were handed down. But what I'm giving over is the basics. The Maggid, along with everything we've said, was fairly sickly his whole life. And especially he had a lame foot. He could not walk easily. And his whole disposition was very weak. And because of his, he was very much into fasting and an ascetic lifestyle, it actually made it much worse. And we know that the Baal Shem Tov was also adamantly against people fasting on a regular basis. He felt it just weakened people and actually made them sad and depressed. Anyways, the Magi was getting sicker and sicker. And the Maggid had heard of the Baal Shem Tov, but didn't think much of him because he was called the Baal Shem Tov, like a miracle worker, a healer. So at a certain point, his wife, friends started saying, "You've tried everything. You're getting worse. Maybe you should go to the Baal Shem Tov." He would not agree, but he got sicker and sicker. And at one point, his teacher, I don't know his full name, but he wrote a book called one second. I think it was the Pnei Yeshua. Yes, the Pnei Yeshua. It was a commentary on the Talmud. And that, at one point of the Maggid's life, was his teacher. And the Pnei Yeshua was not a chassid, but he said, "I think you should go to the Baal Shem Tov to try to get a healing." So very reluctantly, the Maggid decided to go. The trip was not an easy one, and especially for someone who was in a weakened situation. And because of the rigors of the travel, and he couldn't learn like he used to. You have to understand, we're talking about people who learned day and night their whole lives. That's what they did. They learned day and night. And that was their whole reason for being there, was their whole love of life. So on the journey, it was too hard for him to be learning. And he was already thinking, this is a big mistake. I don't even know if I should finish the journey. But he does. He comes to the Baal Shem Tov, and the first time he meets him, the Baal Shem Tov is surrounded with what I call this, simple Jews. And the Baal Shem Tov is telling these parables, these very simple stories, and then explaining them to the people. And the Maggid is like, "I can't believe this. This is like, I came all this way. This is the Baal Shem Tov." Anyways, at a certain point, the Baal Shem Tov actually had his eye on the Maggid for quite a while. He never met him, but telepathically, spiritually, prophetically, he saw that he wants to make the Maggid a student. He saw what a tremendous thing that would be. Anyways, the Maggid finally has a one-on-one with the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov tells him a couple of stories. And the Maggid is so unimpressed, unimpressed. And so the Baal Shem Tov says to him, "Do you learn Kabbalah?" And he says, "Yes." So he handed him the Eitz Chaim, the book of the Rabbi Chaim Vital on the writings of the Arizal. And he asked him to learn a certain piece, to learn it, out loud and explain it. And so the Maggid does. And the Baal Shem Tov says, you're correct, but there's no life to it. There's no soul to it. I'll read it for you now. So the Baal Shem Tov began to read this piece, and it turns out that this piece mentions different angels. And as the Baal Shem Tov is learning this, the Maggid began to experience light filling the room and the presence of these angels. In other words, the Baal Shem Tov was quite literally making this teaching come alive. It was like in real time. And the Baal Shem Tov was blown away. He had never experienced this in his life, this kind of a spiritual experience. And he came to understand that this is no ordinary person here. And to make a long story short, he became the student of the Baal Shem Tov. And ultimately, we could say the primary student of the Baal Shem Tov. That trip, he stayed for a short while, but he had to leave. And he went back to wherever he was living at the time. But then he came back, and he also thought it would be for a short time, but the Baal Shem Tov kept him there for 6 months. And during those 6 months, he learned with him every day. And they also learned at nights. And the Baal Shem Tov started to give over to him his deepest teachings. Because he saw who the Maggid was. He saw his potential. And at one point, because the Maggid didn't expect to be there month after month, and he asked about Shem Tov, he said, why won't you let me go? And the Baal Shem Tov said, because the more water is drawn, the more it comes out. Now, as he was saying, not only are you learning from me, but it's really good for me to have you here because you're helping me to draw new waters of Torah. So here we see there was an incredibly fruitful relationship happening. I will just mention that, so all together, he was only with the Baal Shem Tov for a total of maybe 7-8 months. But I'll just mention that the Arizal was only in Tzfat for 2.5 years. And he even learned less with his student, Chaim Vital. But from those 2 years comes the entire system of the Arizal. In just 2 years, he gave over what would take lifetimes. So the same thing here. The Baal Shem Tov gave over to the Maggid the essence of his teachings. And the Maggid got it. The Maggid really not just bought into it, but he was very methodical. And so what the Baal Shem Tov gave over in inspirational bursts to his students. And for those who have been following this class, when we were learning the Keter Shem Tov, we had an opportunity that many of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov were relatively short and to the point. Now, each one of them was a gold mine. But what the Maggid did later is he turned these teachings into a system. He turned into like an organized system that we now call Hasidut. He was not the only one, but he was the primary one who took the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and created, like I say, a system, a model of all the Baal Shem Tov's teaching in a philosophical paradigm. There's one story, and it's a short story, but it's very indicative. That one time they were davening together. The Maggid was there, and the Baal Shem Tov's talit had kind of fallen over his shoulder. The Baal Shem Tov was, we call it, in a different world and didn't notice. And so the Maggid very innocently came over and put the talit back on the Baal Shem Tov's shoulder. But in that process, he will say he locked into the energy of the Baal Shem Tov, into the aura of the Baal Shem Tov, and it's reported that he began to shake. You know, it was so awesome. It was so awesome. He began to shake. And when he moved away from the Baal Shem Tov, he tried to settle himself by holding onto a table. And the table began to kind of bounce up and down, shake. That is like how awesome the Maggid was hooked into the Baal Shem Tov. It wasn't like a casual relationship, because once he hooked in, he became connected to the Baal Shem Tov's essence. So while we're doing this, I want to mention that why was the Maggid so important? After the Baal Shem Tov passes away, his son, Tzvi, he became the Rebbe, the leader of the Hasidic movement for an entire year. After 1 year at an event where most of the core group of the followers or the Baal Shem Tov were, he got up and said, I have to reveal to you that last night my father came to me in a dream and said, it's time to turn the mantle of leadership over to the Maggid. And he took off his his Rebbe robe, and he gave it to the Maggid. And the Maggid apparently was ready for this. And he began to teach. And the entire core group immediately accepted the Maggid as the new leader. What happens after this is, for approximately 11 years, the Maggid was the leader of the Hasidic movement. But in one aspect, he was completely different than the Baal Shem Tov, because the Baal Shem Tov traveled extensively. The Maggid, very much because of his health situation, he never was totally healed. He definitely improved, and especially because the Baal Shem Tov ordered him to stop the intense fasting. He said it's so detrimental to you, and he did improve, and he became the leader for 11 years. But he moved to Mezrich. The Baal Shem Tov was headquartered in Mezbush, and he moved to Mezrich, and he basically stayed there, and everyone came to him. And in those 11 years, just like the Baal Shem Tov had attracted a core group of Talmudic scholars who then became Hasidim and went out to spread the word. The same thing happened with the Maggid. He attracted, now remember, even before he met the Baal Shem Tov, he was well known as a Maggid. He was well known. And so the combination of his being a Talmudic scholar, a Kabbalistic scholar, and a Chassid, so drew an incredible group of core people. I'm going to just mention some of their names because these Rebbes, and there were more, I'm only going to mention about 8 or 9, but from these 8 or 9 come a flowering of Chassidut, because each one of them then set up their own, they became Rebbes in their own cities, and they attracted a core group. And so it just kept on growing in that manner. So one of them was Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, one of the most famous of the Rebbes. He had core group followers, but it didn't set up like a whole Hasidic court. But he became so well known. One of his books is learned all over the world, Kedushat Levi. Then there was Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, to this day, there are many Vitebsker institutions in many different countries. But his influence was when the Maggid passed away, he became the leader of the Hasidic movement, and everyone accepted him. But he did something in that day very unique. Just like the Baal Shem Tov tried to make it to Eretz Yisrael, he moved to Eretz Yisrael with 300 people. Some say it was actually 300 families. And they became very much the core group of the Jewish community that was in Israel before the mass Aliyah began in the 1880s. He came here in 1770. And he settled in Sfat and then Tveria. He's buried in Tveria. And in fact, for years, on his yurt site, Rav Ginsburg would travel to Tveria and do a whole event at his grave, and then with the Chabad in Tveria. One of his many students was the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, again, I'm not going to be able to tell the whole history of Chassidut here, but the Alter Rebbe became, in a certain way, the main student of the Maggid. After the Maggid passed away, the Alter Rebbe accepted Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk as the Rebbe. And in fact, the Alter Rebbe was going to move to Israel with Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. And part of the journey there, Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk took him to the side and said, no, you need to stay in Europe and spread Chassidut there. You're needed there. And the Alter Rebbe listened to him. And of course, the whole Chabad movement comes from Shneur Zalman of Liadi. But he was a student of the Maggid. There's a whole story about that. Then there was Aaron of Karlin. There are Karliner Hasidim in many, many places, especially here in Eretz Yisrael. It's a huge Hasidut. Rabbi Nachman of Chernobyl, also many students, many institutions, rebbes all over the world. One of them is the Bobover Rebbe in Brooklyn, and a huge Hasidus is the Bobover Rebbe. And then there was Rebbe Elimelech and Rebbe Zusha. They were brothers. Rebbe Zusha is buried with them right next to the Magid. That's how close they were. But Rebbe Elimelech, so in a certain way, he became like a second Magid, because the students that he attracted, they also became major rebbes in their own right. And some of them are the Magid of Koznich. They're Koznich Hasidim to this day. Menachem Mendel of Rimanov. There's Rimanov Hasidim to this day. There's Avram Yeshua Heschel of Apt. And the most important one was Yaakov Yosef of Lublin, the seer of Lublin, the Jose of Lublin. We have like a chain of rebbes who nurtured rebbes, the Baal Shem Tov, then the Magid, and then Rebbe Elimelech, and then the seer of Lublin. The seer of Lublin, the same. He gathered all these students, and then they went out and they became rebbes, famous rebbes. And so here we're really concentrating on the Magid, because the Magid became the main link. Because it's not clear what would have happened to the Hasidic movement without the Magid. If it would have continued to spread the way that it did, if it would have had we'll call it the philosophical foundation and system of Hasidut, as we call it today. So that's the importance of the Magid of Mezrich. I just want to mention just a few more ideas here, and then hopefully next week we will conclude our series. But I want to give like a lead up to that, and that is in one second. 1747 to 1750. This is approximately 10 to 13 years before the Baal Shem Tov passes away. There were a series of blood libels in Zaslav. Blood libels were very common in Europe. The complete lie, of course, that Jews kill Christians to get their blood to mix it in making matzah. It's an absurd, ridiculous proposition, because Jews don't eat blood and we don't kill people for no reason. So nonetheless, the blood libels in their historical perspective created death and havoc for Jewish communities throughout Europe for hundreds of years. Absolutely outrageous how many Jews died because of these rumors, or that Jews poisoned the wells. during the Black Plague. And countless Jews died because of these rumors. So I'm mentioning it because as much as we talk about the Baal Shem Tov as being the teaching joy and the importance of joy in serving God, the Baal Shem Tov himself, of course, was very joyous because he was the living example. But the Baal Shem Tov took very much to heart the trials and the tribulations of the Jewish people. And it was during these blood libels that the Baal Shem Tov was very affected by it. And he would go into actually deep bouts of depression because he was trying to cancel these decrees, which many times he was successful. Sorry, that's one of my fake sneezes that seems to happen during this class every week. Not sure why. Anyways, but during those years, the Baal Shem Tov was constantly praying, pouring out his heart, trying to help cancel these decrees. And they took a toll on him. And it wasn't just this. It's really, if we go back, along with all of the joy and encouragement and optimism and positive energy that the Baal Shem Tov was spreading everywhere, he also had these bouts of such seriousness and even depression over the state of the Jewish people. And so this gets to I think that's a good place to leave it. No, that's a good place to leave it. Next week, we're going to deal with the last years of the Baal Shem Tov. I'll just give an introduction here, because in the Baal Shem Tov's own words, there were two reasons why he passed away when he did. And it's known that towards the end, his spiritual strength weakened to the point where he was not able to do these soul elevations. He was not able to have the prophetic vision that he had. And the two reasons, and we will go into this next week, is that number one, towards the end of his life, what we now call the Mitnagdim, in other words, those who were opposed to this growing Hasidic movement, actually excommunicated the entire Hasidic movement. They put a ban on the Hasidic movement, meaning you couldn't even talk to a Hasid. He shouldn't come into your shul. You can't give him an aliyah to the Torah. It was a horrible split in the Jewish people. It's well known historically. This split, which went on for far too many years, it was finally somewhat healed. But it began with the Baal Shem Tov and we'll call it the fledgling movement. Last week, we went over all the reasons why the scholarly elite were afraid of the Hasidic movement. But it got to the point that they actually excommunicated. They put a ban on the Hasidim. Now you can imagine this took a terrible toll psychologically for the Baal Shem Tov. And we'll go into it more next week. And The other one is that the remnants of the Shabbatai Tzvi movement led to a new version in the personality of a person called Yaakov Frank. And that's what we'll discuss next week. But the Baal Shem Tov said that in his attempt to fight against this ban and fight against the followers of Yaakov Frank and Shabbatai Tzvi, this is what just sapped his energy to the point that he felt that this was going to lead to his demise. So we're going to get into more of those details next week, and then we're going to try to conclude our thoughts about this series, which has gone on for approximately 9 or 10 months. I have to say, I never expected that it would last long, but and as I said previously, truthfully, we could go on for 9 or 10 more years to get through the Keter Shem Tov and all of his teachings. But since Pesach is coming and I'm going away, I felt that this would be a good time. Perhaps we'll get back to it at a certain point.